The air inside the camp hospital smelled wrong. Not blood, not smoke. Something sour, heavy, rotting beneath disinfectant. Boots echoed down the wooden floor. Too fast. Too many. Someone whispered. Another one collapsed. A stretcher scraped the ground outside. Then another. Allied officers stood frozen at the doorway, helmets on, pistols still holstered, watching enemy prisoners rush past them, sleeves rolled up, hands already stained with medicine and sweat. No orders were given. No permissions asked. And yet no one stopped them. A German doctor pushed through the line, shouting instructions in broken English. An Allied guard hesitated, then stepped aside. Why? Why, in the middle of a growing medical disaster, did Allied officers hand control of the camp hospital to men who were supposed to be their enemies? And more importantly, what happened in the hours that followed, that made some officers refuse to speak about it ever again? The year was near the end of the war. Across Allied-controlled territory, prisoner-of-war camps were overflowing. Barracks designed for hundreds now held thousands. Food deliveries arrived late. Medical supplies arrived incomplete. Records were rushed, sometimes skipped entirely. Officially, everything was under control. Unofficially, officers knew the truth. A single outbreak. A single failure in sanitation. One misdiagnosis. And the entire camp could collapse. Guards were trained for discipline, not disease. Allied medical staff were stretched thin, rotating between bases, hospitals, and camps. And inside the wire were hundreds of enemy soldiers, some trained medics, some surgeons, some doctors, now reduced to prisoners. Regulations were clear. Enemy POWs could assist, but never lead. Never operate independently. Never make decisions. Yet small exceptions began appearing. A missing signature on a report. A medicine cabinet unlocked longer than allowed. A whispered request at night. Something was already shifting, quietly, before the crisis even began. Inside the camp, life followed strict routines. Roll calls. Rations. Silence after dark. Among the prisoners were former civilian doctors, battlefield surgeons, and medical orderlies, men who once ran hospitals under bombing raids. Now they cleaned floors, sorted supplies, treated minor injuries under supervision. They spoke little, watched everything. Some guards noticed something odd. When sickness spread, the German POW medics moved first. They noticed patterns, tracked symptoms, marked names quietly on scraps of paper. One guard recalled seeing a POW doctor stare at a patient for too long, then shake his head slightly. No report was filed. Another remembered a whispered warning in the corridor. Too many fevers, not normal. Still, no alarms were raised. Until the morning the first man collapsed. It started with silence. No coughing in barrack C. No shouting during roll call. Then someone failed to stand. Then 3 more. Medical logs didn't match symptoms. Temperatures rose too fast. Weakness spread too evenly. Supplies vanished overnight. Gloves, alcohol, bandages. No theft report was filed. A guard heard footsteps in the infirmary after lights out. Another noticed the German doctors washing their hands again and again and again. One officer hesitated outside the infirmary door, listening. Inside, quiet commands, calm voices. Not panic. Preparation. As if they had seen this before. By midday, stretchers lined the yard. Men lay wrapped in blankets, shivering despite the heat. Allied medical staff were overwhelmed within minutes. Then something unprecedented happened. A senior Allied officer looked at the chaos, looked at the enemy doctors already working, and nodded. No speech, no ceremony, just a single gesture. The German POW doctors took over triage. They separated patients, redirected supplies, ordered guards to move beds. No one questioned them. The air filled with sharp instructions, clinking metal hurried footsteps. Every decision carried risk. Every minute mattered. And somewhere in that rush, a crucial record disappeared. After the crisis stabilized, questions followed. Why were certain patients isolated first? Why were specific medications used, ones not listed in Allied manuals? Why were some files rewritten? Official reports called it temporary cooperation. Unofficially, officers avoided the topic. One report mentioned exceptional judgment by POW medical personnel. Another omitted their involvement entirely. Witness statements conflicted. Some said Allied doctors led everything. Others insisted they arrived too late. And one guard claimed he was told directly, "Forget what you saw." The crisis ended, but the silence began. Officially, the report was simple. Outbreak contained, order restored. Unofficially, pages were missing. Names crossed out. Times rewritten. Margins trimmed too neatly. And that is where the questions begin. What if the German POW doctors recognized the danger before anyone else? Many of them had served on collapsing fronts. Field hospitals with no electricity. Cities without clean water. Makeshift wards inside basements. They had seen infection spread in hours. They knew the smell, the packing of fever, the pattern of weakness moving bed to bed. One guard later admitted something strange. The night before the collapse, a German doctor had requested extra disinfectant. He didn't explain why. He just said, "You will need it tomorrow." How could he know? Medical logs show no official diagnosis before the outbreak peaked. Yet isolation beds were prepared early. Was it experience? Instinct? Or did they recognize something Allied staff were not trained to detect? If they prevented something worse, would officers admit that openly? Or would that be too uncomfortable to record? Because acknowledging it would mean one thing. The enemy had saved lives. And that raises a difficult question. If they saw it first, why wasn't there a written warning? Some testimonies mention unapproved procedures. Nothing violent, nothing illegal, but unconventional. Improvised quarantine zones, different dosage timing, rearranged ventilation in the barracks. One former Allied orderly wrote years later, "They did not ask, they just moved the beds." Regulations required permission for everything. Yet in the chaos, permission disappeared. What if the German doctors used techniques developed under desperate wartime conditions? Methods learned in bombed-out hospitals where survival depended on speed, not paperwork. Effective, but not officially recognized. If those techniques worked, would command want it documented that protocol was bypassed? Or would rewriting the timeline protect reputations? And there is one more detail. A supply ledger shows medical alcohol usage tripled that week. But no explanation accompanies the spike. Why? Records from neighboring camps show similar, temporary medical cooperation during shortages. Brief mentions, one-line summaries, then silence. No detailed breakdowns, no full evaluations. Almost as if these moments were considered necessary, but not discussable. A historian reviewing archive materials noticed something unusual. Whenever German POW medical personnel were praised, the praise was indirect. Assistance appreciated. Support effective. Never specific names. Never detailed actions. Why avoid specifics? Was it fear of public backlash, post-war politics, or simply pride? Admitting dependence, even temporary, on former enemies may have been seen as weakness. But perhaps it wasn't weakness. Perhaps it was practicality. Still, practicality rarely erases entire paragraphs from official logs. This theory is quieter, less dramatic, but possibly the most powerful. What if trust didn't begin during the crisis? What if it had been building for months? Guards had watched these doctors treat minor illnesses daily. Carefully, professionally, without complaint. They followed hygiene standards strictly. They corrected small mistakes discreetly. They never exploited access to supplies. Trust forms in repetition, in small consistencies, in predictable behavior. One Allied officer reportedly said, "I knew which men I could rely on. Not as prisoners, not as Germans, but as doctors." If trust was already there, then the nod in the hospital wasn't sudden. It was inevitable. And that makes the moment less shocking, but far more human. Yet one unresolved element remains. A specific file, referenced in two separate reports, cannot be located in archives today. It described initial containment measures. No copy survives. Was it misplaced, destroyed, or deliberately removed? We may never know. Because wars end. Governments change. But documents sometimes disappear quietly. So which theory explains it? Experience, improvised medicine, repeated quiet cooperation, or pre-existing trust built in silence? Maybe the truth is not one of them. Maybe it is all of them combined. And maybe the real story is not about nationality at all. Maybe it is about what happens when crisis strips away ideology and leaves only competence. Because in that hospital ward, for a few intense hours, there were no uniforms, only patients and doctors, and officers forced to make a decision history rarely acknowledges. A decision that still echoes in missing pages and hesitant memories. So now, after everything you've heard, which explanation do you believe? And why do you think some parts of this story were never fully written down? Years passed. The war ended. Uniforms were folded away. Medals were pinned to quiet jackets. Men returned home. They spoke of battles, of marches, of victories and losses. But when conversations drifted toward the camp hospital, something changed. Voices lowered. Sentences shortened. Some veterans paused mid-story, as if reaching a page that no longer existed. One former guard, interviewed decades later, said only this: "We did what had to be done." He never elaborated. Another officer was asked directly, "Did you trust them?" His answer was slow. "I trusted their hands. Not their flag. Not their past. Their hands." Because in that moment, when fever was spreading, and time was collapsing, and fear was rising like heat inside the wooden barracks, the question was not loyalty. It was survival. History likes clean lines. Allies on one side, enemies on the other. But crisis does something unexpected. It removes labels. It reduces decisions to their simplest form. Can this person solve the problem? And sometimes, The answer comes from where you least expect it. Remember the beginning. The smell in the air. The rushed footsteps. The officer standing in the doorway. The nod. That small, almost invisible gesture. That nod carried weight. It meant surrendering pride, breaking protocol, risking reputation, but it also meant saving lives. And yet, the records remain incomplete. The file describing the first containment measures is still missing. Some names never appear in official summaries. Why? Perhaps because the truth complicates the narrative. Admitting that trust crossed enemy lines during wartime challenges the simplicity of history. It forces us to see individuals instead of sides. Maybe that is why the story faded quietly into archives. Not erased, just softened. But here is the deeper question. If you were standing in that doorway, hearing the coughing, smelling the sickness in the air, watching men collapse, would you have made the same decision? Would you have trusted them? Or would pride have stopped you? That is the part history cannot answer. Because the real crisis was not only medical, it was moral. And moral decisions rarely leave neat documentation. In the end, what remains is not a perfect record. It is a moment where survival mattered more than allegiance, where enemy doctors became simply doctors, and where Allied officers chose practicality over protocol. Some stories are loud. Battles shake the earth. Explosions rewrite landscapes. But this story is quieter. A hospital ward, dim light, tense silence, and one decision that blurred the line between enemy and ally. So now the question returns to you. What do you think truly happened inside that camp hospital? Was it necessity, respect, hidden cooperation, or something history was never meant to reveal? Tell me your theory in the comments, because sometimes the most powerful wartime stories are not about who fought whom, but about who chose to trust when it mattered most.